Hey everybody, today is January 9th, 2025, so a very happy new year to you, your friends, and your family. To start out the new year right, what we're going to do is dive into your online business's installs. Specifically, we're going to look at the percentage of your installs that become a monetizer over time. However, we're going to be segmenting this by install month so that we can see, hey, in the new year, how is January 2025 installs doing versus January, February, and March 2024 installs? So let's head over to MySQL now, and I'll show you how to recreate this analysis for your own business. Okay, so here we are in MySQL, and the first thing we're going to do is go to our table of customer logins and select the very first login date per customer and call that the customer's install date. So here's our table, and then here are a few records. So again, it's just login date or login date values per customer. And then we're simply going to select the very first login date per customer and call that their install date. So we will do customer ID and then login date. And we're going to take the minimum value here. So the very first login date, and we're going to call it the install date. So within your own business setting, be careful doing something like this. Make sure you talk to the data engineers on your team and make sure that previous data isn't being archived, because you want to make sure that this truly is the customer's first login date. And to elaborate on that a little further, I've worked at companies that archive all of their data and only keep the last 6 months of data. So in a situation like that, you're going to take the minimum date of the last 6 months of data for a customer. And in such an example, you'll be missing the customer's very first login date because it got archived away and isn't accessible to downstream analysts. Okay, so let's return to our query. So we are taking the min login date per customer. That's going to be their install date. Let's run a few records. Okay, great. So we're going to go ahead and put this in a subselect and call it installs. And let's go ahead and write some SQL above that to bring in those fields from the subselect using installs as the prefix. Okay, great. So you'll remember that in the analysis that I showed earlier, we are segmenting or comparing the percent of installs that become a monetizer over time between different months. So we are effectively comparing January 2025 to January, February, and March of 2024. So in order to do that, we need to take the install date and revert it back to the first of the month. So I'll show you how to do that now. And this will be the field again that will segment our data. So we will do date format. And we're going to take this install date and we're going to convert it to the first of the month. So we will do this. and we will just call this install month. And like we always do, let's run a few records. Okay. Okay, great. So our method is working. As you can see here, we have a customer ending in 6349 that installed September 17th, 2023. And then the install month was correctly converted to September 1st, 2023. So the next step we need to take together is bring in all the leading dates so that we can say 15 days after install, this percentage of installs from this month became a monetizer. And then 25 days after install, this percentage of that same install cohort became a monetizer. So obviously we're hoping that that metric increases over time. So let's go ahead and add those leading dates in. So we have a table here called dim date, and in the second column of this table, we have a date column with date values. So let's add some logic into a join statement and bring those leading date values, ensuring that those leading date values are either greater than or equal to the install date per customer. So we will do a left join over to this date table, and we can call the date table dates, and we're going to do it on the dates, which references this table. And then within that table, this column, which is date, has to be greater than or equal to the installs, meaning from this subselect, the install date. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring in those leading dates. So based on the logic, any dates that are equal to or greater than this install date. So we're going to run a few test records right now. Fantastic. So we have the customer, their install date. We have all dates that are greater than or equal to this install date, and then the install month. So the next thing we want to do is we want to create our x-axis. If you recall, it's days since install. So let's add that in now, because again, we're going to be grouping our data or aggregating our data to two things: days since install and install month. So let's get days since install. We'll do a date diff between this leading date value and the install date. We can go ahead and rerun this to preview some of our data. Okay, great. So now we're ready to take the next step together, and that is to bring in monetizer or revenue information. And what we want to do is per customer, per leading date, we want to check to see, have they become a monetizer yet? So the way you need to think about this is whenever a customer installs your mobile game or interacts with your online business for the first time, by default, they start out as non-monetizers, but maybe by day 3 or day 7 or day 8 or day 200, they become a monetizer. So what we need to do is for each of these leading date values, we need to create a flag next to this column and check to see if they become a monetizer. So we're going to do that now. The first thing we need to do is go to our revenue table and figure out when the customer made their very first purchase. and any leading date value that is equal to that first purchase date or greater than that first purchase date will be flagged as a monetizer. Okay, so we do have a table here called fact player revenue. And it's a table of customer revenue transactions. Okay, great. So here's a preview of that revenue transaction data. So each customer, the purchase date time, and the purchase amount. So all we simply need to do here is just take the minimum purchase date value per customer and call that their very first purchase date. So we will do customer ID, and then we will do purchase date. And then we will take the min of that and call it the first purchase date. And then because it's an aggregate function, we want to group by customer ID. Okay, so let's run a few records here. And this is just returning the very first purchase date per customer. Fantastic. So let's go ahead and join these two subselects together. We can call this players. We can call this second subselect revenue. And we're just going to do a left join here. And we're going to do it on players.customer ID. So customer ID from the first table or the first subselect is equal to customer ID in the second table or the second subselect. And then most importantly, from the second table or second subselect, the first purchase date has to be less than or equal to the leading date value in the first table or first subselect. And remember, the leading date value is in a field called date right here. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring the fields and logic up. We want all of these columns. We just have to change out the prefix because it's referencing a different subselect. So now we're referencing players. Call this players dot install month. Day since install. The install date. And then the leading date value. Now here's what we're going to do. In our second table or second subselect, we have the player's first purchase date. And we're going to write a case statement here and say, case when this is not null, then 1, else 0 end. And this is going to mark our data row by row so that we know whether or not that install by that leading date value or day since install has become a monetizer. So we're going to call this monetizer flag. And I'm going to explain this again. So if we look at this join, most of the logic is actually in this join, where we're saying, let's join on customer ID between these two tables, and where the first purchase date is less than or equal to the leading date value. So if this gets returned and it's not null, it means that player by that leading date value has either purchased on that leading date value or some previous or historical value, allowing us to mark them as a monetizer. And again, we're fulfilling that in this case statement right here, where it's saying if a first purchase date is returned, meaning it happened either on this leading date value or sometime historically, then call them a monetizer, if not, 0. Okay, so let's run a few records now. Okay, great. So we have exactly what we need. We added this 6th column here, which is the monetizer flag. And what it simply means is, for example, we have this install ending in 563. They installed May 30th, 2024. It's saying by January 6, 2025, they're a monetizer. They either monetized on January 6, 2025 or sometime earlier. So they've monetized sometime between their install date and this leading date value right here, January 6, 2025. Okay, cool. So we're now ready to aggregate our data. So first thing is we're grouping our data by 2 fields, by the install month and then by days since install. And then we just want to count. This will be our installs. And then we just want to sum our monetizer flag. And we're just going to ultimately take this field and divide it by this field, and we'll get the percentage of installs by days since install that have become a monetizer. And we're going to visualize and segment that by the install month so that we can compare January 2025's performance to January, February, and March of 2024. And it's super useful because today's date is January 9, 2025. So the month isn't even complete yet, but we can still do that type of tracking to see how we're performing year over year compared to the same month or other months in that same quarter. We can just call this monetizers. And let's just group by these 2 fields up here. Okay, here is our final query. Let's go ahead and run this. Okay, everybody, so here is our final data set. All of our data is properly aggregated and grouped to days since install and install month. Remember, we're going to be segmenting or comparing each of the install months to each other so that we can see how January 2025 is trending versus completed months in the prior year. So January, February, and March of 2024. So let's go ahead and do that in Excel. Okay, so here we are in Excel. The only thing we need to do is create a new column or calculated field, which is monetizers divided by installs. And that'll tell us the percentage of those installs that have become a monetizer by however many days since install they are from. Okay, so let's add that column, percent monetizer, and we will do monetizers divided by installs. And then let's go ahead and transpose this data by using a pivot table. So we're going to select all of our data and we're going to create a pivot table. And we're going to say we want the install month across the top in the form of columns, days since install on the rows, and then we want the actual value of the install month, and then the percent that became a monetizer. So let's go ahead and remove the grand totals off of rows and columns. And then let's remove this blank right here. Let's go ahead and change the formatting to decimal place. And then let's go ahead and just look at the first 6 months after install. So we're going to be looking at January, February, March of 2024 and the leading 6 months there. And then the leading 6 months for January 2025, which is only going to be 9 days. But the purpose of this is to see how January 2025 is performing or trending versus historical data that we already have. So we will do label filters less than or equal to 180 days, so roughly 6 months. And then again, let's only look at install months that we want to compare. So we want to compare January 2025 to January 2024, February 2024, and March 2024. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and visualize this data in a chart. Let me move the legend down to the bottom. And there you go. So with any mobile game or online business, you're likely purchasing installs from ad networks, and it's part of the cost of acquiring a customer. So because there's an acquisition cost associated with each customer, it's super important to know and track over time what percentage of those installs or what percentage of those paid installs become a monetizer. So in this specific example, we're looking at January 2025, which we only have 9 days of data for, as compared to January, February, and March of 2024. As you can see, January 2025, which is represented by this orange or gold trend line, is already doing better than January and February of last year or 2024. So the new year is already having a great start per this analysis behind me, where together we looked at the percentage of your installs that become a monetizer over time, segmented by install month. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining me on this special tutorial. Happy New Year.